All right, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this surprisingly beautiful day, given that we just had snow and 30 degrees and all that. Today's talk is John Dyer from the Department of Dermatology. He is not going to be talking about dermatology. And just before we get started, can all of us please silence our cell phones? And this is our penultimate Saturday morning science for the week. Next Saturday is our last one, and it will be Chi Ren Shu and a large rotating cast of characters who will talk to us about artificial intelligence. So I'd love to see you all back for that one. So let's welcome John and hear about apples and cider.
It is now. How's that? All right. Normally, I don't need a microphone. I'm loud enough as it is. Well, I really, really appreciate you all choosing apples over the astronaut and coming out on this Easter Saturday. It's really, really great. I feel like I did stack the room a bit with my family and friends just in case it was a little sparse. But I thought, and this was sort of a request of my friends as well, I thought it would be fun to talk about something that I'm really, really passionate about outside my day job, which is apples. And my family, my poor, long-suffering family, knows all too well how intense I get about apples. And so I apologize, because the truth is this talk is too long for the time session. So if I'm running over and you need to leave, please do. But I kept thinking as I was putting this together of this gentleman, Michael Perry. I don't know who in the room knew Dr. Perry, but Dr. Perry used to teach an undergraduate course, a 1-hour honors college course on baseball cards and baseball card collecting, as I recall. And I've always thought it was a great example of someone, although being the chair of internal medicine for a while and a very, very well-known and famous cancer physician, he also had this side hobby that he allowed to grow. And I always have taken, I've always felt like my apple obsession sort of is in the same boat as his baseball card obsession. So um, the day, this is tough with my whole family here, but I put it in anyways because somebody noted that it was 420, and the whole angle of the apples is I'm trying to make a case that I think that we could have a good cash crop for Missouri. And so I was going to lead in by saying I'm here today to talk to you about a very promising, lucrative cash crop for Missouri, and then do that, and then segue very rapidly so that it didn't go out on the internet to this, because I do think I think that apples are a promising cash crop despite where the Missouri industry is right now. And so that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. I'd like to talk to you a little bit um, about sort of at least a vision for some things that could be done here. This is a quote from Liberty Hyde Bailey, very, very famous horticulturist, former founder of the College of Agriculture at Cornell, former chair of the Department of Horticulture at Cornell, who said, "Why do we need so many apples? Because there are so many folks. A person has a right to gratify their legitimate taste, and if they want 20 or 40 kinds of apples, they should be accorded the privilege." And we are just now emerging from a long monoculture in the world of apples, and so Liberty Hyde Bailey was very, very ahead of his time. There are many, many different types of apples. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they have many, many different uses. And now that the public has relearned that, the future for apples, I think, is much brighter. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about history, the history of apples, some basics on apple genetics, and mostly what we're going to review is the nature of different apple cultivars, how they're propagated, and then the role of apples in cider making and cider production. And then briefly we're going to touch on a few fun stories in the apple world, maybe a mystery if we have time, and then wrap it up with what things we might be able to do here at Missouri. So, believe it or not, apples are related to roses. They're a member of the Rosaceae family, along with pears and many other fruiting plants. They're, depending on who's doing the counting, there's anywhere from 25 to 47 different species. And they're very, very polymorphic. As you saw in the picture previous, there are many, many different forms of apples. They come in all shapes and sizes, all colors. They are believed to have originated in Kazakhstan in Central Asia during the Cretaceous period about 70 million years ago. And then about anywhere between 50 and 20 million years ago, there was large-scale differentiation of apples, at least based on some of the genetic analysis that's been done. In these areas of the world, there are literally apple forests, entire forests filled with apples, every single tree unique. And it's thought that the bear or similar large animals were one of the primary consumers and targets of the fruit. The thought is that bears would climb up the trees, eat the fruit, and then disseminate the seeds all around, and that they've been helping spread apples, at least prior to when humans came on the scene. But once humans figured out that apples were good to eat and had many, many different promising qualities, they started to disseminate apples. And the spread of apples genetically tends to follow the Silk Road. So they migrated east to China, and there's certain cultivars there that are somewhat unique. And they migrated west to Europe and even making their way to England. Apple propagation, grafting, was known by the Greeks. It's written in many of their older works. Theophrastus wrote about it and described grafting in several apple cultivars in his Historica Plantarum. Pliny the Elder described over 20 varieties of apple and some pears, a few of which are thought to still exist, although it's hard to ask Pliny. The Romans were instrumental in disseminating apples widely throughout their empire, bringing them to Britain and many other places. In Europe, the native apple may have cross-pollinated with the domesticated apple may have cross-pollinated with the European crab, and that may be the source of some of the cider apples we're going to be talking about later. But also there were just many seedlings, so there were many, many new varieties. In the Middle Ages, monasteries were the source of the knowledge in terms of how to propagate trees, so they became the center of apple growing and fruit propagation and growing. Colonists, when they came to North America, apples were one of the first things they brought. They brought seeds and they brought cuttings. But very rapidly, because grafting was rare and both knowledge and how to do it and how to grow the rootstocks, they planted lots of seeds. So the early colonies were filled with seedling orchards of apples and other fruits. And that was the source of many of the varieties that we have today. John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed, was instrumental in actually planting numerous seedling orchards. He's described as an apple nurseryman or apple grafting person, but actually what he did is he went along, he just had a bag of apple seeds, and he would plant trees, because when you planted apples, it claimed the ground that you planted the apples on. If you had fruit trees growing on the ground, then it became arable. So this is a time in the States when the diversity in apples exploded. All these seedling trees, each one was a new variety. And although many of them were not very valuable, some of our great apples, including some that exist today, came from this time period. But importantly, apples were not, it was not a one-size-fits-all thing. This was a time of great nuance and elegance in terms of apple consumption. One variety would be used for cooking, another variety would be stored, another variety would be used to make cider. And some were used solely for drying, some were used solely for cooking down into sauce. So the different varieties had very, very distinct purposes, and those that were growing and using the apples at the time knew that. So as we move into the 18 and 1900s, that's considered sort of the pinnacle of apple cultivation. We're going to touch on that a little bit later in the talk when we talk about the history of American cider apples, because this is really when our country, coming out of the Revolution, declaring itself on the world stage as a world power and, importantly, an intellectual power, our horticulture and our ability to convey and transmit our knowledge of American horticulture was one of the things that our founding fathers used to declare themselves on the world stage, to say to the Frances and the Englands of the world that the colonies were not just an unintellectual backwater. With improved transportation throughout the 1800s, specific cultivars became more than regional, and that's where Missouri comes in. Prior to the big expansion to the west, Missouri was was the highest, the region that grew the most apples in North America. For a brief time, we were the pinnacle of apple production in the United States. Around that time was when Stark Brothers Nursery was incorporated, and Stark Brothers had an enormous role, both certainly in my family, where that was where all my family members ordered their trees from, all the trees that I grew up with on the farm. But many other farmsteads around did the same. And Stark Brothers was also one of the first to actually name a variety, to patent a variety. So in the new fruit fair that Stark Brothers had just 4 years after they were incorporated, they were put out a call for new fruit. And this farmer from Iowa who had a tree that he tried to cut down multiple times and it kept growing back, and then it fruited, and he thought, it's actually not a bad apple. He sent that apple in. And the head of Stark Nursery tasted it and he said, "Why, my, that's delicious." And that became the delicious apple. A few years later, a family in West Virginia sent in a yellow apple that they also thought was delicious. So since that one was yellow, they named it Golden Delicious, which meant the Old Delicious had to now be Red Delicious. And that's how you ended up with Red Delicious. And a monoculture was born. Stark Brothers collaborated with none other than Luther Burbank. So Missouri, for many years, was a pinnacle of fruit growing and fruit research and exploration. Reagan in 1905 cataloged the number of named apple cultivars over the past 100 years in the United States and came up with 6,654 different kinds of apples in that time period. Many of those are no longer with us. Post-World War II, after the rise of industrialized production, you saw a massive erosion in genetic diversity in apples. And apple growing became very much a monoculture. Golden Delicious, Red Delicious. Many of the old varieties disappeared. And I meant to show this. I always thought it was interesting. If bears really were what disseminated the apples in Kazakhstan, isn't it interesting that Stark Brothers thought to use the bear as their logo? Yeah. So what happened with Red Delicious? And because how could we go from the head of Stark Nurseries, who presumably knew something or two about apples, saying, "My, that's delicious," to the mealy, tasteless apple that we've all grown to loathe? So this is actually the apple, or the type of apple that Stark first tasted. This is called Hawkeye. It's the original Red Delicious. And it's actually not a bad apple if you ever have a chance to have one. This is the Red Delicious I remember from farmsteads when I was a kid. And many of you, if you tasted it, you'd recognize it. It's sweet, it's got some crunch, it's got a little bit of tannin to it, a little bit of bite. But it's not a bad apple. And unlike what I've been called multiple times. But what happens over time when you grow an apple like this is in the nursery or in the orchard, you'll have your tree, and you'll notice that there's one branch that's different. Now, this isn't a Red Delicious. In this case, this is a flowering difference. But if you notice, all these flowers are white, except for this one branch where they're pink. And that's called a sport. So apples are, as we will touch on here, are very genetically promiscuous. And they are constantly evolving and mutating, both in sexual reproduction, but also just in developing mutations. And so in these massive orchards of Hawkeye that were planted to supply markets, every now and then somebody would notice a branch of apples that were redder than the rest of the tree, or that ripened a little earlier or a little more evenly. And so they would take cuttings from that branch, and a new sport of Red Delicious was born. And so that's how you end up with this gradual evolution over time to these large, very pretty red, but completely tasteless apples. It's a selection process. They're being selected solely based on appearance or orchard performance with no consideration given to taste or quality. And so evolution proceeds. I always thought it was interesting. This is the poison apple from Snow White. I just always thought it was very interesting that it was, even though it was sort of pre-delicious, they basically selected for it in a way. But no less than the New York Times has noted the demise of the Red Delicious because tastes are changing. The consumer is getting more and more knowledgeable, and there are many, many different varieties now that consumers are looking for. Apples are a very, very important temperate fruit crop. They tend to grow in a wide variety of climates and areas, and they're widely adaptable. They can be winter hardy, but they do need some chilling, but there are some forms of apple, some cultivars of apple that can tolerate relatively warm climates. They can grow in the south. And because they range so widely in fruit character and storage ability, you can really end up with nearly a year-round supply. And that is to be able to provide a product like that year-round is incredibly appealing, no pun intended. Um, Glad you're paying attention. That's good. Um, Now, who grows all the apples in the world? By and large, it's China. They have they outpace everybody, as you can see, sixfold or more. And China is also one of the major producers of juice. So something to be aware of. In the states, where are apples grown? Primarily Washington State. This is the high desert. This is highly irrigated land. New York State, Michigan, very, very prominent. Missouri, we're not even on the list. We don't even get a 1%, but Waverly and a few of our areas are noted. We at least have one major apple area. But the problem is Missouri's orchards are struggling, and part of the reason for putting this talk together and thinking about apples is to think about how can we come up with creative ways to support Missouri's orchards. So Michael Pollan, if any of you have read The Botany of Desire, the apple was one of the plants that he reviewed in that. And I just like this statement, where whenever the apple tree goes, its offspring propose so many different variations on what it means to be an apple, at least 5 per apple, because there's usually at least 5 seeds per apple, and every seed is different. Just a little bit of genetics for my nerdy friends. Apples have 17 chromosomes and that are then duplicated. They are relatively recently derived from a simpler ancestor. The things to know that are really important: many apples are self-incompatible, so they have to be pollinated by a different variety. That enhances the diversity. They're incredibly heterozygous, which means that they have, at multiple different genetic points, they have varying copies of the same gene, which is why every time a flower is pollinated, you get this massive shuffling and you end up with so many new varieties. The whole genome sequence, the first was released in 2010. Thank you, Stark Brothers. It was Golden Delicious that was chosen to be the reference genome for Apple. And a newer high-quality genome was released in 2017. Interestingly, transposable elements, so viral DNA represented about 60% of the apple genome. And clearly, some of the mutational events and sports and cultivars that have developed are the product of retrotransposition and the like. So we've hinted at this, but I think it merits discussion, because how do you reproduce an apple? The apples do not breed true. So when an apple flower is fertilized by pollen, even if you have an apple that will self-pollinate, very often, most of the time, the seeds that you get will in no way resemble the parent. So there's natural recombination due to that high heterozygosity, and they tend to regress towards a mean, sort of a more ancestral crabapple type phenotype. And so the other thing to remember is typically apples are pollinated by pollinators, and that bee doesn't just visit one flower and collect pollen before it lands on the next flower. It's got pollen from many, many different flowers that it's visited. So any given apple stigma may be pollinated by a number of different pollen grains. Um, this is probably more than we need to go into, but the thing to remember is that every apple seed is a completely unique genetic entity, and um, and so even when you plant 10 seeds from a given apple, that's 10 different trees that you can grow. So every apple that exists, every apple that you eat, is actually the product of cloning. So uh, the all trees of any given variety are clones of the original tree. So if you like Jonathan apples, I picked that because that's my name. If you like Jonathan apples, every Jonathan, it's terrible, isn't it? I know. Every Jonathan apple is actually that you eat is coming from a tree that is effectively a branch of the original Jonathan apple tree. So that's the only way that you can keep those going. And that's what the Greeks knew and the Romans knew and humans have known for millennia. So you take a cutting from an existing tree that you like and you graft it onto a rootstock. And then you just let that top part grow, and that grows the variety that you've grafted on. And then if once this is a new tree, if you want to make more Jonathan trees, you just take a new cutting. And basically every bud on a branch is a potential new tree. Now, what I like about that is that individual cultivars can last for a very long time. They can just keep being propagated. This is an apple called Desio that's in England, and Desio was thought to have been brought to the United Kingdom by a Roman general over 2,000 years ago. It's a very, very old apple. Nobody to really check that out with to make sure it's true, but that's the story. So I like it. So how do you do grafting? This is what's called a whip and tongue graft. This is what I like to do when I make trees, just because it's secure and stable, and I have better luck with it. You take the rootstock or the base that you want to use, and you make a slanting cut, and then make a little back cut in it. You make a matching cut in the piece of wood you want to join, and then you mesh them up, wrap them up tight, and this is sort of what that looks like. And you end up with a little apple bud ready to grow your new tree. If it's wrapped up well, what that will do is actually callus together. And as long as there's appropriate contact between the two pieces, they will transmit um, sap and fluid across that cut, and then it will heal itself, and you will have yourself a new tree. Another way to do this, which is some nurseries use, is called budding. This is called chip budding, where rather than doing the big slanting cut, you just put in one bud into the stock, and that will also heal in. And I've done this too. I just don't have as good of luck. So what's cool about this concept, if you really think about it, because I said this would be art and history, is this means that these things can cross. Apples are just one example of plants that can really stretch across time. And this is one of the things I love most about it. So one of my favorite apples is one called Asopus Spitzenberg. It originated in New York in the late 1700s. It's a very pretty apple. It's actually one of the parents of Jonathan. It's good enough that it got its own little food and wine write-up about one of the apples that you'll, what they say, one of the best you'll ever taste, but so why is nobody growing it? And it was also a favorite of somebody else who was very, very famous. And so what I think is really neat about an apple like a Spitzenberg is I don't know what Thomas Jefferson really looked like. I don't know what he sounded like. I don't really know much about him. I can read his writings and you can get an idea, but I can eat a Spitzenberg apple and I know exactly what Thomas Jefferson liked to taste when it came to an apple. And I think that's kind of a neat concept. And that's going to be true of many of the apples that we talk about today. So originally, all apples that were brought to market or became famous were just the result of random chance. There were lots of seedling orchards, and somebody would identify a good one, and that would be that, sort of the way the Golden Delicious or the Red Delicious came up. However, with time, more formal breeding programs developed, and that's sort of where things set now. The goal here in these breeding programs is time from pollination to getting a cultivar to market. Traditionally, it took decades from the initial pollination of an apple flower and the planting of those seeds to the actual release of a new cultivar. This is where Honeycrisp came from. This is where Macallan came from. these very long evaluation breeding programs. Even if you're doing it as aggressively as possible, this natural way, it takes about 4 years after cross-pollination to get your first fruits, and typically years 5 to 7 are actually used to evaluate the cultivar, um, and it's often into the teens before it's out. And this is important because this is not an efficient process. In one European breeding program, they estimated that of 50,000 seedlings that they planted, only 3 ended up being good enough to justify breeding rights. The Minnesota group would say it's about 1 in 10,000. So about 10,000 seedlings to get one usable apple to market. So if that's taking you 15 years, that is an enormous amount of time and resource. So now, it is interesting because we are talking about cider apples, and it's probably a little easier for those. There's a little less, you're a little less persnickety with the cider apple. But there's all sorts of tricks people have been using. Extra light to accelerate the development of the newly sprouted apples so that it goes into an adult phase. With that, you can get fruiting 3 years after planting. You can do rapid growth in a controlled environment to where you can get flowering 12 to 15 months after germination. There's even been an approach using some sort of transgenic approach to get it down to a few months from sprouting the seed to getting a flower. But now, molecular genetics are leading to a revolution in sort of how we approach, or how apple breeding is approached, with the identification of DNA-based markers that are associated with certain traits. And this is getting more and more prevalent. There was just a paper out that I saw, I'm putting this together, on using artificial intelligence to help analyze the markers as they get more and more, oh shoot, I shouldn't have done that. As they get more and more markers, it's more and more difficult for a human eye or a human brain to process it. So pretty soon it's going to be AI. We're just going to be having these massive sequences that a computer is saying, okay, number 40,051 and number 769, those are the ones we want to grow. But this is what's being done to increase efficiency, and that saves on cost. Marker-assisted selection means a lot of seedlings that would be propagated for several years before you realize they're not viable get flushed out of the system very early. Now, I personally think there's, no system's perfect, so you always wonder what you're missing, but this is still the way things are going. And what are we trying to do with apple breeding? It's a constant evolution. You're trying to maximize the fruit quality and desirability. We're trying to get away from the red deliciouses of the world and get a variety of higher quality fruit that's also disease and pest resistant, as well as maximizing the performance in the orchard, both the performance of the tree itself and then the fruit. To do this, you really need maximum genetic diversity going into the system. So it is important to have a wide cadre of cultivars to breed with. Other things that specific breeding programs are starting to focus on, novel flavors. There's actually some really crazy tasting apples out there. There are apples that taste like curry. There are apples that have pineapple. There are apples that have licorice. Some apples rumored to taste of violets. So there's all sorts of different flavor profiles out there. Red-fleshed apples, we'll touch on near the end if I have time, are a big, big research area for Michigan State and a few others. And now cider making qualities is something that's starting to be selected for. Something to think about, though, these breeding programs, I guess I didn't have my slide of that, but the breeding programs are located in Washington State, in New York, in Michigan. We don't have a breeding program in Missouri. And so one problem that we've already run into is the apples that grow well in New York State or grow well in Washington State may not grow well in Missouri. And so it is important, I think, that we keep in mind our unique terroir and growing area and the demands that it puts out there. So there is actually, I didn't know about this until I put this talk together, a Midwest Apple Improvement Association, a group of Midwesternish growers who are really working on selecting cultivars that actually will grow well here in the Midwest. And most importantly, climate change is already affecting the more northern growers. The Minnesota growers, the Michigan growers are noticing the effects of climate change. Washington State, the Pacific Northwest, is one of the areas that is predicted to most rapidly evolve in terms of its temperature. So having better adapted cultivars and being able to more rapidly adapt our cultivars is going to be very important. And then just out, it was only a matter of time. CRISPR, you've heard about CRISPR and all these other areas. They've got good, robust protocols for using it in apples as well. So all of the breeding that we've just been talking about is all natural breeding. You're just allowing flowers to be pollinated, and then you're analyzing the progeny. It's just we're faster at analyzing the progeny now. But with CRISPR, once we identify a disease resistance gene that we want, well, now we can just plug it in if we want to. And then you've got a genetically modified organism, and that brings all sorts of other issues to the table. But that will be coming. All right. So good. I think I'm okay on my timing. So we're going to talk about cider now. And how does this relate to the apples? So when I talk about cider, I grew up with cider being synonymous with apple juice, but that's not really the case. In this case, we're talking about hard cider, which is fermented apple juice. Apple juice, unfermented apple juice, is considered sweet cider. At both are growing markets, actually, and promising markets for fruit, but hard cider has absolutely exploded in the last 10 years. Trowbridge said, whoever thinks that any apple is good enough for cider had better not engage in the business. And it's been recognized by those that know what they're doing in making apple cider for a long time, that there are specific apples that are really good for making cider. There are many, many cultivars of apple that exist only to be ground up and pressed into juice. They're almost worthless for anything else. What are the, and for those that, the analogy to grapes is exact. You don't make wine from table grapes. You don't make apple cider from a red delicious apple or a typical table apple, at least usually. What are cider apples like? They tend to be miserable to eat. They tend to be very acidic, very tannic. They often will have high sugar, but they're often called spitters. You pull one off the tree, you bite into it, and you immediately spit it. It's like eating a crab apple off the tree. Yet those same qualities that make it terrible to eat make it wonderful in terms of a juice production and then a fermented product. There are many, many different varieties of cider apples, and you can sort of read in these numbers the viability of the cider culture in these countries. Over 800 different varieties in France, 600 in Spain. Many are specific to each province and region. Well over 80 in England, and in the United States, not very many. And that's what we'll talk about. This is a fellow named Roger Wilkins. He's one of the most famous cider makers in the UK. He works in Somerset. His image will show up a couple other times, but he is a true classic cider maker in the most traditional farmhouse sense, and a very interesting fellow. So how do we think about cider apples? There are a variety of different ways to classify them. The most commonly used one is the one that was developed at Long Ashton Research Station back in the early 1900s, and where apples are divided based on their acidity levels and their tannin levels, so into sharp, bittersweet, and sweet. And these characteristics, acid and tannin, are both very, very important in having a good quality finished cider product, and balancing these is critical. Now, the problem with this, like any other system, is it doesn't account for sugar content, and that is also important, and especially when we're dealing with some of the apples here in the States. So why even talk about cider apples as a viable product? Why would it be interesting here in Missouri? Well, when you're growing apples for the market, an enormous amount of energy, time, and intervention is taken to create things that look pretty. Consumers buy with their eyes. That's why Red Delicious got very, very pretty and completely tasteless, because people didn't care what it tasted like. If it looked pretty, they would buy it. And so growers for the consumption market, the dessert market, have to use a lot of inputs. They have to make sure the apples are irrigated so that they get big enough. They use a lot of herbicide, a lot of pesticide. They have to do thinning of the fruits. The apples have to be harvested very, very delicately. Who here likes Honeycrisp apples? See, everybody likes Honeycrisp apples. What gives Honeycrisp that crunch is actually a genetic mutation that makes the cellular structure of the Honeycrisp flesh twice the size of a normal apple. That's why it gets very crunchy. It also makes it very, very delicate. So Honeycrisp cannot be harvested mechanically, or it bruises. It has to be harvested by hand. So it's very, very expensive. That's why you pay $3 a pound for it to get Honeycrisp to market. Um, with cider apples, nobody cares what they look like. Nobody even cares if they're a little bit ugly looking, or sometimes even if they're a little bit brown. All that matters is, do they taste good? So you don't really have to worry about insect damage too much or blemishes. You don't have to worry if the apples get bruised shaking them off the tree. There are a lot of other things that kind of go out the window with growing cider apples. In fact, the key thing about cider apples is that they're mature. You really want to make sure that the apples are fully ripe before they're used to make cider. And that's, believe it or not, the exact opposite of what a lot of commercial growers do. A lot of commercial growers harvest their apples immature and then post-ripen them using artificial means. And that way, because an immature apple is harder and it transports better. So you don't have to worry about an immature apple rotting as fast. And this is the Cornell starch iodine test that you use to determine, iodine turns purple with starch. So the riper the apple gets, the less starch there is, and the less purple it gets. It's something that can be done in the orchard to determine ripeness. So you want a little different character. These are Roger Wilkins' hands, the cider maker you saw before, stained dark brown from pressing apples in the fall. Most cider apples have a lot of tannin in them. These apples tend to be very almost crab-like. They're small. They're kind of a miserable thing to deal with in the orchard. They'll often drop fruit. They often bloom late, which puts them at risk from some of our diseases. These are old varieties, so a lot of them have latent viruses hidden in them because they've been propagated for centuries. They've picked up all sorts of stuff. But the truth is, a lot of that doesn't matter because they're in such demand right now because of the way the cider industry is, that many of these things kind of go out the window, even though that if you were trying to sell it as a dessert apple, you'd never be able to make it work because of the demand in the cider market. You can get away with it. So these are just a few examples just so you can see what we're talking about. This is one called Porter's Perfection. These are all British apples that we're going to be looking at. Porter's Perfection is fun because it makes a lot of fused fruits like this, little Siamese twins. And it tends to be a pretty popular apple. This is one that we grow in the States called foxwhelp, but most of the apple growers, we call it the fawwhelp because it's not actually the real foxwhelp apple. Foxwhelp is a very, very famous British cider apple, and whatever this one is, somebody brought it over or thought they had the foxwhelp and they got the wrong one. Mislabeling has been a problem in the apple industry for centuries, as we'll see shortly. This is actually, blindwood means branches that don't ever fruit. So a lot of these varieties, some of these varieties are just terrible. In fact, one you're going to see in the next picture is notorious for just making, there's all these branches that don't ever set fruit. And so when you're orcharding, that's sort of wasted energy, wasted space. So this is the real foxwhelp. There's actually a program through the USDA where you can bring over cultivars that don't exist in the States, and they go through a quarantine process. And we brought foxwhelp over the real foxwhelp about 10 years ago. It hasn't fruited here yet, but we'll see. It's a kind of an interesting apple, actually. It's still widely used in England, and it's very mutagenic. It mutates very easily, so it throws a lot of bud spores, more so than most other cultivars, which is why we think that's probably how the fawwhelp made it to the States. A couple others. One of the most famous cider apples, the one that you'll always read about, is this one called Kingston Black, that when it's in its finest form, just by itself can make a single variety cider. It's sort of the holy grail of cider apples is one where you can just use one variety to make a good cider. Most of the time you have to do a lot of blending. The problem with Kingston Black is it is terribly unproductive, and there are great YouTube videos of guys online who have like 12 Kingston Black trees, and there are fewer apples on all those trees put together than one other apple variety. So it's difficult, depending on where you're at, to count on Kingston Black in the orchard. But these are just a smattering of some of the varieties that people have been planting. These are all the known or named varieties, the ones that are famous. And they've contributed to this craft cider boom. Now, in this day and age where people are watching gluten, they're trying to stay away from as heavily processed foods and drinks, cider consumption has exploded. And it's double. In fact, the total volume cider consumption has doubled every 2 years over the last decade. Now, this is important because all these cider apples that I've been talking about so far, those things were a novelty for the last century in the United States. Nobody in their right mind would plant, well, most people in their right mind would not plant an orchard of cider apples. It was like there are a few people that did, and now they're swimming in it, but most people did not. And so there are not remotely enough cider apples to meet this demand. So right now, you can make as much money on cider apples as you can dessert apples, even though they can be blemished and they can be ugly and they can be small. Nobody cares. There are enough producers, there's enough demand that people will pay for these specific varieties with these unique characteristics. And the same is actually true for unfermented cider if you've got the right heirloom apples. And so there's enormous, enormous demand. This is just a map of cider producers in North America. A few years ago, there was a massive gap right in here. The Midwest and Missouri had nothing. Now we've got a few, although in Missouri, some of this has to do with licensing rights. If you make cider, so if you're Schlafly or Boulevard, if you make a cider, you can qualify as a winery, which changes your tax rates. So that's one of the reasons why it's done here. But anyhow, so since there's not enough apples to go around, what do people do? Well, they make what we call sort of industrial cider. Some people call it alcopop, whatever. It's basically priced like beer. It's made to compete with beer, and it's mostly made from juice concentrate, mostly from China or Eastern Europe. And basically, you're just these folks. The volume that they need to produce is such, they're just trying to get whatever they can to run through the fermenter. And then they run it through so they can call it cider, and then on the back end, they tweak it, either with added acid or added tannin, carbonation, or alcohol or the like, added sugar. So a lot of these are basically, you can make something that tastes moderately like cider. It's not good, but just with sugar, malic acid, water, and some carbonation. So there doesn't necessarily ever have to see an apple to taste like that. And there are some studies that I just quoted here that are kind of fun. Even in some French ciders, using mass spec measurements, they determined that some of the French ciders that shouldn't have been adulterated were actually artificially carbonated. And then this one, which is one of my favorite ones, looking at the carbon isotopes in American hard ciders, fruits, let's see. So fruit trees use C3 form of carbon, whereas monocots like corn or sugarcane use C4. So if you analyze a cider and you look at how much C4 versus C3 there is, you can make a determination as to where the sugars in the drink came from. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting is if you look, there's a decent number of ciders on the market where sugar is not necessarily listed on the ingredient label that have a predominant portion of their sugar actually coming from sugarcane rather than apples, which tells you that the bulk of that cider is actually just, CNH or whatever. It's not. And so I thought that was kind of a fun little study to see. So we've been talking about all these. We've been talking about the shortage. We've been talking about the demand, and we've been talking about British and touched on French and Spanish. But what about American cider apples? I mean, we had that boom from the 1800s to the 1900s, right, where there were all these other apples being grown in the United States, all these different varieties. We got a Spitzenberg. We even got a Red Delicious. So what about the cider apples? There were American cider apples that were grown specifically for cider making. And at the time in the States, and they were selected because they required minimal intervention. At one point, I saw a map of Jefferson's gardens at Monticello, and he had his kitchen garden, which was this delicate walled thing right outside the house, and then he had his dessert orchard, which was just down from the house. And then there was the cider orchard, which was like way out on the back 40, and you could tell like basically they just let that thing grow until they went in and harvested the apples in the fall. So most cider apples are survivors. They're there to grow fruit once a year, and they don't get much other attention. And I always thought that those might be really, really valuable traits for apple breeding, because an apple that can do well with neglect is the kind of apple that's going to do well with me as its grower. Um, so when I first started looking at this, it was far easier to get British or French apples. You couldn't really get American cider apples. And why was that? Well, you got to think a little bit about America's cider history, which is really interesting because during the colonial period, cider was incredibly important. It was the predominant drink. Most of our presidents made and drank cider. John Adams drank cider every morning that he got up. Um, and that was because water wasn't always safe to drink, and they had limited nutrition, and cider was a very nutritious beverage, and it would keep. And apples were easy to grow. William Henry Harrison, even though he was fairly wealthy, it was hard cider and log cabin for the Harrison campaign because it was viewed as a common drink, and he used that to relate to the common man to get the vote. And this was the time when we shifted away from, as we shifted away from drinking cider. This was the statement that I thought was really funny. This was from a European who said American fruit growing advanced rapidly once they started eating their fruit rather than drinking it. So as the change started to happen, as you go back and try and learn about American cider apples, the big reference that I like is this one. This was the book that put us on the map, the book that declared to England that the colonies actually had some intellectual life. And this is a book called A View to the Cultivation of Fruit Trees by William Cox, who's one of my heroes. He was in Burlington, New Jersey. He had a very large farm and orchard back when New Jersey actually was the Garden State. And so he wrote this book that got a lot of attention in England because it, for the first time, described many of the varieties and cultivars that were being grown in the colonies. So he's a good reference point. So if you look at Cox's book, he lists off these different varieties of apples that were used to make cider. And so we'll return to this list in a minute because it's important. So during the 1800s, with industrialization, with immigration of German settlers and introduction of beer-making techniques, the rise of farms, and grain production, beer became much cheaper and quicker to make. And it's a lot easier to store grain and make beer at any time throughout the year than it is to store apples and make cider. The common nature of cider was now considered a negative, and so gradually, and cider orchards just weren't very profitable. It's not exactly the best use of land if you can grow corn on it or wheat. So many of the orchards were cleared to plant more profitable crops. And then, so the cider industry, which was already in a massive decline, once Prohibition came along, it sort of killed the industry, and many apple orchards were actually cut down at that point, and many cider cultivars, including the ones on Cox's list, disappeared. So when I first started looking at this, it wasn't 1990. I'm not that precocious, but there were a number of these varieties that were presumed extinct. And I just draw your attention to a few of those because we're going to talk about them real quick. So there's a group of people out there that get to be apple sleuths. They're sort of cider explorers. And this is a fellow named Tom Burford. He was actually quoted in the New York Times Red Delicious article. He's the penultimate sort of authority in the States on apples. He grew up on an apple growing farm. And so he, as well as a few other folks, just went out and started looking for old apple varieties. They'd read reports about where they were grown, and they'd see if they could find them. It's actually really hard to do. We've got an example here coming up where I'll explain that, but many of these apples were grown at times where it's not like you had pictures. It's not like you had really clear descriptions of the actual apples. The descriptions are sometimes a little nebulous, and you might not even have anyone left who remembers the original. So this is a we're going to talk about the Harrison apple because it's the most famous American cider apple. And so this is an article from 1864 where somebody's talking about what made the cider good in New Jersey was the apples that they used, the Harrison, and it lists a few other varieties. So the Harrison apple was one on the list that was thought to be extinct. So yet we now have it. In fact, that's what these little graphs are down here, which will, if folks want to take one home, they'll be able to. But so Harrison was a very famous New Jersey cider apple. It was supposed it was the predominant apple that drove the New Jersey cider market for around 50 or 70 years. New Jersey cider was incredibly famous. It was shipped all around the world. And so in 1976, this guy from Vermont just had read about it. He's like, yeah, I wonder if that apple's still around. I'll go look. You know, you couldn't find it in catalogs anywhere. It's not like you could order it from Stark Brothers. So he goes to New Jersey where it was grown, and he stops in at a cider mill called Nettie Ox Cider Mill, and he gets a donut or something and coffee, and he's like, yeah, I'm looking for these Harrison trees. And the person there's like, oh, well, that's a Harrison tree right out there. So he's like, cool, can I get some cuttings from it? And so he took some cuttings from that Harrison tree. And this is Nettie Ox Cider Mill, sadly now defunct, as many cider mills are. And he takes them back to Vermont, and he grafts it off and grows some Harrison apples and checks in with them. And then just a few months later, they cut that Harrison tree down to expand their garden. And so he's like, oh, well, that's cool. And so he's like, yeah, I'll go back to Jersey next year and look at some other places. For the next 10 or 15 years, he kept looking, never found another one. And it's sort of like the story of the Lorax and the truffula trees, but that Harrison tree was one of the very last Harrison trees, and he just happened to stumble on it right at the beginning. And so a second tree that was thought to be a Harrison was found in Massachusetts in the early 1990s, and they sent apples to Tom Burford, who I showed you the picture of, and lo and behold, the Harrison has been rediscovered. One of the things that allows us to be sure of that is there's pretty good documentation. So there's old paintings back before photography. This is the art part of the talk. There were people that their job was just to paint accurate from life images of fruit. This is from the USDA watercolor collection. If any of you like these types of things, I urge you to take a look. They're all scanned in online now, and they are beautiful. And this is a woman named Deborah Passman who did these paintings. She's one of the best of the USDA watercolorists. And down here it says, Professor Reagan says this is the true Harrison cider of Cox. So that is a good reference point for the apple. So now, as of the last time I sort of looked at this list, several of these missing apples have been found, but there's still a few that are missing or we're not sure about, some of which we'll probably never be sure about. But if you're willing to sit with me for another few minutes, I'll tell you a story about another one on that list, and at least my hypothesis about it. So one of the really fun things I've done in my time in playing with these apples is finding out about this. So we were talking about Cox's original book that put us on the map in terms of fruit growing. Well, it turns out he was working on a second edition, but he never got it finished because he kind of got sick and then fell off the project. And years later, let's see, I forget when he died, late 1820s or 1832 maybe. So almost 80 years later, his family donated the manuscript to that second edition to the National Agricultural Library. It's now been scanned in, so you can look at it online, but back in the day when I did this, you had to go and look at it in person. And you can check it out, and it's basically William Cox's garden notebook with his handwriting and everything. And who here are gardeners? Who likes to garden? Good, so some of you. So when you read through this, it was very resonant for me because William Cox is just like all the rest of us. He had this big list of varieties to plant next year and stuff he crossed through and ones he didn't get to. And then there was another list. And he made a lot of mistakes. And he had varieties that he thought were one thing, but they weren't. He even had varieties like this one where he decided the whole thing was wrong and he crossed the whole thing out and rewrote it. Now, mind you, this is the guy who's the reference point for 2 centuries worth of apple growing in many ways, in terms of these American apples. He also made neat notes about what were his favorite cider fruits, and he referred to this guy named Timothy Matlack. Anybody know who Timothy Matlack is? It was kind of a fun. So he talked about, oh, this is Timothy's number 5 cider fruit. So this is Timothy Matlack, who turns out to have been a pretty famous guy back in the day. He had very good handwriting, and so he's the guy who actually wrote the Declaration of Independence. Um, that's his handwriting, and because he was the secretary to the Continental Congress. So that's kind of neat. So all these guys knew each other. Cox knew Matlack, they knew Washington, they knew all of the founding fathers. So there are a couple cider apples of great historical interest that we're still looking for that were on that list. One called the Gloucester White and one called the Taliaferro. I was just out at Mount Vernon earlier this year, and they're still looking for the Gloucester White because Washington planted large quantities of it at Mount Vernon. And in these historical orchards, they like to restore these things. Same with the Taliaferro at Monticello. So there are interesting overlaps between the two when you start digging. And the thing that's really interesting is in at least one publication where there are letters going back and forth between Jefferson and William Cox, they refer to the Gloucester White and the Taliaferro as almost the same apple, even though they're thought to be different. So over the years, people have been looking for Jefferson's Taliaferro. There's only one published description of the actual apple. Someone has made this composite based on that description. And the problem is Jefferson himself, even though he loved this apple, never actually describes it. He doesn't tell you what it looks like. There were lots of things Tom didn't go into detail on, I guess. But so it's really hard to know, are you dealing with the actual apple or not? The thing that's very interesting, though, is that this one published description of the actual apple doesn't exactly fit with the little bit that we know about it. And just so you know, my theory is I think this was I think that part's wrong. So some years ago, a guy, a Virginia apple grower, went out into the hinterlands to look for old apples, and he's talking to these guys, finds some old apple growers, cider makers in the hills of Virginia, and he's asking about Taliaferro apples. And they're like, oh yeah, we got a Taliaferro. We make cider with it. He's like, really? Like people have been looking for that for years. And they're like, oh yeah, sure. And they give him cuttings. And so years ago, I got cuttings from him, and this is the fruit that it makes. So it was supposed to be a small 1 to 2 inch in diameter yellow apple, not fit for the table. This is not a small apple. It's fairly large, in fact. And he had already decided when he sent it to me, he's like, it's not the Taliaferro. It can't be. It's too big. It doesn't fit the published descriptions. And he'd gone back and told the guys he'd gotten the wood from, and they were kind of dumbfounded. They're like, well, my grandfather called this a Taliaferro. They're like, this is what we've always called a Taliaferro apple. How can it not be a Taliaferro? And he's like, well, I don't know, but it's not a Taliaferro. So the apple has some certain characteristics that are kind of interesting. They fall off the tree as soon as it's ripe, and the tree drops its leaves pretty soon after. This is a branch of it grafted to a different tree, a Spitzenberg tree, in fact. Spitzenberg tends to have long, willowy growth. The Taliaferro tends to have short, kind of stubby growth. So I leave you with that as I say, there's far better information on the Gloucester White apple that we're looking for. Multiple sources of information, including the Cox manuscript. So Cox wrote this long description of the Gloucester White apple, and actually one of the most fun things I've done is actually checked his references. So he actually referenced an article in this National Intelligencer from 1810, and he was good. His citations held up. So where you get more descriptions of the nature of this Gloucester White apple. What was it like? And so what do we know about it? We know it was larger, nearly the size of one called a Newtown pippin. It was yellow in color. Stem end often had red flecks. And apples tend to drop right when they're ripe, around the 1st of October in Virginia. The tree tends to drop its leaves right after they fall, and it tends to have stubby branch growth. The other thing that was helpful with the Cox manuscript is there were 2 books there. One, which was his garden journal. The other was a bunch of plates, because his daughters, all 3 of his daughters, learned how to paint apples and paint fruit. And they were the ones that were the source of this original painting of the Harrison apple. And one of the other things that they made paintings of was the Gloucester White. So it's not exactly like having a photograph, but it's almost as good. And so this is the Taliaferro cultivar that we grew, so the one that the old guys from Virginia thought was called Taliaferro. And it's seen pictures of it before. It's about the size of a Newtown or Albemarle pippin. It tends to have the red flecks at the stem end, deep cavities, and tends to match up pretty good, I think. And so, interestingly, since I first started looking at this, there are two other representations of the Gloucester White apple that exist. This is another version from one of the Cox manuscripts, and this is actually in the USDA watercolor collection. It made it to Deborah Passmore, and she painted it. And so, one of the things that I think happened here is I think this is a great example of just regional naming. And my guess is that this is the Gloucester White apple. It fits very, very well. Most importantly, it tastes just like it should. It's tart, it's acidic, it's a very good cider apple. But it's not very productive. I don't know that it's going to be the savior of the Missouri apple industry or anything, but it's a fun historical novelty. And I just wonder if this is not, if George Washington's Gloucester White wasn't Thomas Jefferson's Taliaferro, and if both, if both names were applied to the same one, and that would explain why the Virginia guys were so confused. But anyhow, this is the fun kind of sleuthing we get to do. It's hard to know for sure. A person's never going to be definitive, although now with some of the DNA testing that we can do, you can sort of go back and assess potential parentage of apple varieties. So I'd love to, one of my dream projects in the next year or two is just to sequence this and see what it looks like, see maybe if we can tell where it came from. So I'm almost done, I promise. So the whole point of this talk is to talk about cider apples and what they could be for Missouri, because the Missouri apple industry is really struggling. And I really do think that cider apples or using Missouri apples in cider production could be a viable way to help the industry. But the real question is, okay, what do you do? Can you use the ones that we've got? There's some studies just very recently out looking at common apples, things like Red Delicious, and saying, okay, if we use them differently, can they make a better apple cider than they do normally? What if we harvest them earlier, or what if we handle them differently in the press house? And we've got a lot of questions that we need to answer. How do traditional cider apple cultivars, whether it's the Taliaferro or Gloucester White or one of those British ones, how do they grow in Missouri? Because I'll tell you what, some of the apples that are famous in Britain for making amazing cider are lousy here because it's too hot and we have too much disease pressure. That said, others of these historical apples really hold up very, very well. This is a study from Virginia looking at a number of cider cultivars, and this is one of because the Harrison hadn't been grown in any reasonable numbers for a while. This is one of the first studies where you actually get data on the Harrison. And if you run through this, what you'll find is Harrison looks like one of the best cider apples you could possibly imagine. And I'll tell you, Harrison grows like a weed. It is, I tied it back into the 420 thing. I didn't even mean to do that. But it is an amazing cider apple. It's tannic, it's acidic, it's got incredibly high sugar. And so it really is if anything, it's too vigorous. It's almost like the Norton grape is, the Harrison, at least the ones that we've seen. There's a huge interest in the role of anthocyanins, which are pigments in plants, and their role in human health. So there's an enormous effort right now to look at the use of red flesh cultivars, breeding better ones that are more usable, and especially ones that can be used in cider production. Well, we need to try these here, see how they grow here. We've got some grafted out to see how they do. But this is just another area that we need to study. So I just point out there are a couple folks here that know far more about this than I do. We do have an enologist and a pomologist at the University of Missouri. So, and I know that they've started making some apple cider and started exploring some of this. And I tell you what, he's made some decent cider out of what should have not been great apples. So there's at least some promise. So who knows? Maybe we can get something going at Missouri that can be, interesting moving forward. So That's it. I did bring some, these are Harrison apples. If anybody has any interest in taking one home, you're welcome to. We'll just wrap it up and send it with you. They just would need to be planted out. But I'm happy to answer any questions either now or afterwards. I know I ran over a few minutes, but I appreciate it very much.
Alrighty, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and I'll bring you a microphone.
You don't mention Canada at all. I used to live in Prince Edward Island, and there was a whole path in the eastern part that was all neglected heritage apple varieties.
You bet. Yeah, Canada's amazing. So they've got their own incredible heritage, both in apples and in pears. And so, and with global warming, Canada may be the new Michigan. So we may be getting all our apples from there. But they've actually got a wonderful history. And what Canada's really done recently in the cider world, so they've got their own cider industry that's burgeoned, and they've really worked at using. Again, they had the same issue. They did not have all these traditional cider cultivars up there, but they've worked at using the cultivars that they do have, which are a little better suited than like a Red Delicious to cider production. They've also, the Canadians are responsible completely for ice cider, which has become a big thing. A way to, make lemonade out of lemons with your cold weather up there, I think. But
The amount of apples that the Chinese are growing is staggering compared to everyone else. Besides the obvious, what do they do with all of them?
what do they do with them all?
Without, obviously eat some. Do they do anything else?
I think so. They've got a really robust processing mechanism that a lot of it gets turned into juice concentrate, which will hold for better or worse. I mean, you can store that juice concentrate for a long time, ship it all around the world, and then use it as a sweetener in a variety of different things.
I'm not sure if you already know this, but Mizzou will be welcoming a new tree breeder who has a genomics background and an interest in all things that you talked about today.
I love it.
So later this summer, he'll be arriving, and I think that you should make an appointment to talk
I think
to
I
him.
should. Yes, I should. Cannot wait.
I like Lewisburg apple cider. Do you
Yeah.
know much about it? As far as
Sure.
on their website, they say they pick them from the apples from the Missouri River Valley. Is
Mhm.
that in Waverly? Our
Mhm.
apples?
I think so. I think they source from all around that area, and they're Mizzou grads, I think, aren't they? Lewisburg, aren't they? I think so. At least I'm pretty sure they are. Yeah, they do. They try and. I mean, again, like a lot of these folks, a lot of the cider makers. There are a lot of these cider makers that would really love to source local fruit. They'd pay a little bit more for local fruit if they could just get it. They just can't get it because it doesn't exist. Now, there's a limit. There is a limit. It's a saturatable market, and because it depends on the style of cider you're making. In the UK, what's happened, they actually have, they had this massive explosion in cider apple production about 5 to 10 years before us. And the problem in England is the taxation rates changed. And so it's very, very expensive to make and sell cider there. So all of a sudden there's a lot of cider fruit going unused, and they're actually, it's almost like a CRP program. They're paying people not to pick it, to let it just go, to not flood the market.
I know you've had this interest for a number of years, and I'm kind of curious, could you tell us a little bit about your home orchards and how you're dealing? Right now, we have just a few apple trees, but can you tell me how you're dealing with like the beetles that have just been decimating our orchard?
Oh, my orchards, like my orchard, or my trees. So first of all, I'm very fortunate to have married into an apple growing family. And I'm very fortunate to have a very tolerant father-in-law who bails me out more than I can possibly imagine. Like I can't even tell you how much he actually does to, because like if it were left up to me, like it would just be a barren swath of nothing. Like I think that's the challenge. I think it is incredibly hard to grow things in Missouri because we have everything, every pest. When we first started planting trees 20 years ago or so, we just set the trees out. I don't think we even fenced them. They grew just fine because there were hardly any deer then. Now the deer are thick as thieves. I mean, and even when I cage my trees, they'll push the cages over. They'll kill trees that are this big around, stripping off the bark if they can get to them. And so it's very, very difficult. My orchard, my trees sort of reflect my state of mind, which is they're unkempt and not always in the best shape. But I think honestly, what I would say is the key things are you don't want to overplant. You want to make sure that you have a manageable number of trees and that they're in an area where you see them constantly. If I lived where the trees were, I think it would be better. If nothing else, because I could just sit out there with a rifle or something and pick off the varmints. Oh yeah, yeah. Well, and if you live if you live near the river, you'll start getting bears because there are black bears over by the river, and they'll start. There are people we know where they've got pears where the bears will climb the tree and just strip off all the pears. We've got it all, But again, I mean, where our trees are is near where the bourgeois have their vineyards, and it's a struggle every year, but they do it. They pull it off and get the grapes grown. And I think with enough, it just takes a lot of effort. But again, that's where if you're focusing on something that doesn't need to be the prettiest thing in the world, where it's more the taste that matters, I think that's a sweeter spot for us, probably, given all the pressure we have.
Some labels call it dry cider. What is that?
Just so traditionally, dry just means that you've fermented most of the sugar out of it, and so that there's not a lot of residual sugar. There are ways, both naturally and unnaturally, to make cider sweeter. And a lot of the bottled ciders now, they're all fermented dry. Actually, they run them till they're dry, and then in the back end, when they're putting them in the bottle, they'll add back a little sugar to it, which may be partly why some of these have the C4 sugars in them.
Alrighty, if there are no other questions, we'll have another round of applause for our speaker.